A new exhibition at Tate explores the relationship between painting and photography through some of the most famous artworks of recent times. But what about the relationship between the two in the early 19th century when photography was first developed? Although the invention is often viewed as a standalone scientific breakthrough, in fact, painters and printmakers were also innovating, in some ways even more so than early photographers. The idea that the invention of the camera suddenly caused artists to break the flat picture plane ignores the ways painters have been moving in this direction almost since the first uses of perspective as we know it. Since the early Renaissance in the 15th century, artists had used linear one-point perspective, much like the one the camera uses. Over the centuries, however, painters slowly began to break free from this. Around the time we begin to see photographs, Degas was using perspective, but only as a way of organising the visual chaos of his compositions. In many of his canvases, lots of things go on at once. Some figures are only half seen, parts of bodies or objects appear at the edges of the canvas, and it's only perspective which enables us to understand what's going on. In other words, he was no longer using perspective to create the illusion of 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional plane, but, like other modern artists who followed him, trying to represent a single flat picture derived from the complexity of a 3-dimensional world. In this way, Degas' work, alongside his contemporaries like Cezanne, is exemplary of how painting was moving into abstraction alongside, as opposed to as a result of, the invention of the camera. Another way in which photography should be seen not just as an external influence on art, but as an integral part of a continuously changing idea about artistic expression, can be found in landscape painting. Artists in the late 18th and early 19th centuries were moving away from an idealised picturesque aesthetic towards more wild depictions of nature. This challenged neoclassical ideals because it stopped placing emphasis on man's control over nature, as well as moving away from calm atmospheres, which represent civility and order, to more intensely sublime ones. Alongside romantic painting, the camera was the perfect way to show real, rugged landscapes. This showed the beauty and power of God and his creations that didn't need to be manipulated into a composition beyond basic framing. Early photographers and painters also took inspiration from each other's techniques. Chiaroscuro, the contrast of light and dark which creates depth in a painted image, was applied to photography, and some painters began to use brushwork to create the illusion of a shallow depth of field. Photographer Henry Peach Robinson pioneered a style of photomontage which combined multiple negatives to create precisely collaged and layered images. The way he would build up his images was reminiscent of the organisation of figures in a painting, each part chosen to show the best, if very slightly physically impossible, angle. His most famous photograph, bought by Prince Albert, shows a bedridden girl dying of tuberculosis, or possibly, as suggested by the Shakespearean title of a preliminary study for the image, of a broken heart. The image was notorious not only for its so-called artificiality, thanks to the composite image technique, but also as the subject was seen to be too painfully raw and intrusive to be photographed. The styling and subjects of the image was also heavily inspired by pre-Raphaelite painters, and he compared his technique to Zeuxis' combination of the best features of 5 different women from Crotona to produce his picture of Helena. From the movement towards abstraction in painting throughout the 19th century, to photography's part in breaking down neoclassical ideas in society, to the sharing of techniques, photography and painting should be seen as working alongside each other within the canon of art history.